The hum was the last thing I remembered, a low, vibrating tone that made my teeth ache. We'd been standing inside the containment ring, six of us, all in full tactical gear waiting for the count. The air smelled of ozone and oil. My heartbeat matched the pulse of the machine. Then came the flash, too bright, too long, and something inside me folded in half. When I woke, there was no light, just the weight of mud pressing into my face and the taste of iron in my mouth. My helmet was gone. My comms were dead. The sound of the world had changed. No engines, no voices, just the distant calling of creatures I couldn't name. I pushed myself upright. The sky was wrong. The stars were unfamiliar, wider apart, scattered across a deep indigo canvas. And the moon, it was closer, enormous, bruised with gray and gold. He'd seen simulations of ancient skies and survival training, but nothing like this. My suit was half burned. The wrist display blinked nonsense. Temperature, pressure, humidity, all unstable readings. The ground beneath me was thick with ferns the size of small trees, and the air was damp enough to taste. Somewhere nearby, something moved slow, deliberate, heavy. I reached for my sidearm. Empty holster. My knife was gone too. Instinct screamed louder than thought, so I crouched low and crawled toward a ridge. Below it, a valley opened up green. Endless, alive. There were fires far off in the distance. Small, controlled, human. I wasn't alone. The realization hit harder than the fall. Some people were here. My mind ran the checklist. Hostile assessment, contact protocol, linguistic unknowns. But beneath all of that, another thought whispered, this isn't possible. I spent the night in the trees, wrapped in half a shredded uniform, eating roots and drinking rainwater. When dawn came, the sun rose thicker and redder than it should have. I stood there barefoot in the mud and said it out loud for the first time, I'm not home. Days passed in fragments. Hunger made me sharp, not desperate. I followed the smoke trails. I learned the rhythm of the forest, the hours when predators hunted, when birds fell silent, when the earth itself seemed to breathe. Once I found a carved bone spear embedded in a tree trunk. The tip was blackened with ash. Someone nearby understood fire. On the fourth day, I saw them. A group of hunters, bare-chested and painted with streaks of ochre, dragging a carcass the size of a horse. They moved with brutal grace, speaking in guttural sounds that were half song, half growl. I stayed hidden, watching. They carried no metal, no sign of refinement. One of them looked up suddenly, straight toward me. I froze. His eyes were pale gray, almost silver, and for a moment I thought he knew. Then he called out. Others followed his gaze. I ran. Branches whipped my face as I pushed through the undergrowth. The shouts behind me grew closer. I stumbled, fell into a stream, and let the current drag me away. When I finally crawled out, bleeding and shaking, I realized the truth with a kind of cold clarity. I wasn't lost in a jungle. I was lost in time. The experiment hadn't failed, it had worked too well. And whatever year this was, I was at the beginning of something humanity wasn't yet ready to name. I spent that night carving words into the dirt with a stick, a habit drilled into me by years of mission logging. Day 7. Possible temporal displacement, pre-civilization environment, human contact, hostile, objective, survive. The words washed away by morning rain, but they didn't matter. I'd already begun my mission, not to return, to endure, to understand. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and disbelief, a single thought glowed like an ember. If I was the only soldier left from the future, then maybe I was the first soldier in history. It took a week before I dared approach the valley again. Hunger has a way of defeating pride. My body had thinned out muscles sharp against the skin, veins pushing under the dirt. It'd forgotten how loud silence could be when it wasn't filled with radios and machines. I learned the sounds of this world like a language. The hiss of distant rain meant hours of safety. The click of insects under leaves warned of predators. The rhythmic thump at night drums maybe told me the tribe I'd seen wasn't far. By the ninth night, I had a spear, a crude one, carved from hardwood and fire-hardened at the tip. My training screamed for steel, for precision, but adaptation was the only weapon left. When you're stripped of everything human, you start to understand what survival means. That morning, I followed the trail of hoof prints down toward the plains. A herd of deer-like creatures grazed near the water. I crouched low, feeling my pulse slow to match the rhythm of the earth. My arm tensed, ready to throw. Then I heard Ada whistle, short and soft. I turned. Behind me, a boy no older than 15 was watching, half hidden in tall grass. His skin was streaked with charcoal, his eyes bright and curious. He held his own spear, lighter and sharper than mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he made the same whistle again and gestured forward. Hunt together. I hesitated. The last time I trusted strangers, I fell out of the century. But something in his stance was open, calculated even. I nodded. He smiled. We hunted like ghosts. 2 bodies, 1 rhythm. When the herd moved, we moved. When they paused, we froze. He raised his hand, signaling the target. I mirrored him. When the deer bolted, we both threw. His spear struck true. Mine landed short. The boy whooped in triumph and bounded toward the kill. I followed, cautious, scanning for others. But there were none, just the 2 of us and the dead creature between us. He knelt, pressed a hand to its chest and said something low. A prayer, maybe. Then he looked up at me, grinning wide, and thumped his chest twice. Caro, he said. I pointed to myself. Michael. He repeated it, macaw, and laughed like it was some kind of joke. We dragged the carcass together back toward the hills. I kept expecting his tribe to appear, but they didn't. When we reached a narrow gorge, he stopped and gestured for me to wait. Minutes later, he returned with others, 3 men, a woman, and a child. They looked at me as if I were a wild animal that had somehow learned to stand upright. The woman touched my shoulder, then stepped back quickly as if burned. One of the men whispered a word I couldn't understand, something that sounded like Turan. God, spirit, demon, who knows? But Caro defended me. He jabbered fast, mimed the hunt, then lifted my crude spear and shouted my name again. Maka, the tribe murmured. The man who had spoken before gave a reluctant nod. They let me walk among them. That night they shared food with me, meat roasted over open flame, herbs crushed in stone bowls, laughter echoing into the dark. I sat in the circle, silent, watching the sparks rise into the air. Their eyes caught the firelight like gold coins. Every gesture, every sound felt ancient and familiar, like watching humanity learn itself all over again. When the others slept, I stayed awake, studying the stars, trying to find some fragment of home. I could almost hear the hum of the machine again, the pulse that sent me here. I whispered to myself, adapt, don't interfere, survive. But the longer I watched Caro sleeping beside the fire, the more another thought formed, quiet and dangerous. Maybe I was sent here for a reason. At dawn, we went hunting again. This time, when Caro whistled, I answered. When he threw, I struck true. And when the tribe saw my aim, they no longer looked at me with fear. They looked at me with recognition. The first hunt wasn't about food. It was the moment I stopped being a stranger and started becoming a story. They called themselves the Turan, which I later learned meant people of the flame. Fire wasn't just warmth to them, it was belief. Every spark was a spirit, every ember a voice. When they sang around the fire, it wasn't to celebrate, it was to speak to the ones who came before. I was their ghost from somewhere else, the man who fell from the sky. They didn't have a word for soldier, so they called me Maka Turanman, born of flame. I didn't argue. Days turned into weeks. I began to understand their rhythm, the way they measured time not by hours but by hunger, by moonrise, by the sound of insects after rain. They taught me how to hunt with nets woven from reeds, how to dig for roots that stung the tongue but cured infection, how to listen for the heartbeat of the earth before storms came. And I taught them things I probably shouldn't have. At first it was small, the simplest of knots, stronger than theirs, faster to tie. Then formation showed to hunt in pairs, how to flank prey instead of chasing it. They learned quickly, too quickly. When a rival tribe raided their outer camp one night, my instincts took over. I woke to screams and firelight, and before I even knew what I was doing, I was shouting commands. Words didn't matter, tone did. I pointed, gestured, directed. Caro moved first, his spear flashing in the dark. Others followed. We drove the attackers back into the trees. By dawn, the tribe stood in a stunned silence around the bodies. Their chief, a broad man named Oren, looked at me with something between awe and fear. He raised his torch, lowered it slowly, and bowed. From that day, they began to listen. Caro shadowed me constantly. He wanted to know how I saw things before they happened, how I knew where the enemy would strike. I tried to explain the idea of patterns, of training, of reading movement. He called it seeing with the fire inside. I stopped correcting him. One evening while the tribe rebuilt their huts, I sat with their healer, a woman named Sira. She was older than Oren, with hair silvered by ash and eyes that seemed to read thought. She studied me the way I once studied targets. "You dream of another son," she said in her broken tongue. I froze. "What?" She pointed upward at the stars. "Not ours. You look there too long." I didn't answer. She smiled in a way that felt like she'd seen this before, like every age had its ghosts. "You will lead them," she said softly, "but fire burns both wood and hand." That night I couldn't sleep. Her words echoed like distant thunder. The terrain began to change. Their hunts became organized, their fires brighter. They built walls around their camp, something they'd never done before. Oren asked me to show them how to make the weapon of thunder. I laughed, thinking he meant guns, but he meant fire traps. So we built them. Pits lined with sharpened stakes and flaming oil crude, but effective. Each test drew cheers and fear. I didn't feel like a savior. I felt like a man rewriting a book he had no right to touch. One morning, Caro brought me a gift, a strip of metal hammered flat and tied to a bone hilt. It took me a moment to realize what it was. They'd scavenged it from an old meteorite that had fallen seasons ago, the first blade of the Turan. He held it out proudly. "Maka Turan," he said, "King of Fire." I wanted to laugh, to refuse, to remind them I wasn't theirs. But something inside me had already shifted. When I took the blade, the tribe erupted in cheers. Oren raised his hands, declaring it a sign from the spirits. I didn't argue this time either. That night, when the firelight danced across their faces, I realized something terrifying. History wasn't waiting for me to survive it. It was waiting for me to shape it. The Turan grew bolder. Their fires reached higher into the night. Their laughter echoed farther across the valley. But with light comes attention, and attention is its own kind of death. It began with whispers, smoke seen beyond the eastern ridge, hunters missing along the river, strange footprints near the fields. Oren dismissed them at first. "The forest plays tricks," he said. "The shadows are hungry for stories." But I knew the signs. The pattern was too familiar, reconnaissance before an assault. Someone was watching us. We started night watches. Caro and I took the first shift. From our perch above the gorge, we could see the fires of the Turan flickering like stars trapped in a bowl. "They think we are strong now," Caro said, "but fire makes enemies jealous." He was right. On the third night, it happened. The forest lit up with movement, silent, coordinated, almost military. Figures with painted faces and bone armor emerged from the dark. Their bodies glimmered with oil and ash. No war cry, no warning. They came like a wave. The Tehran panicked. Chaos ripped through the camp. Old training took control of me. I grabbed Caro's shoulder, barked orders not words, but rhythm, gesture, tone. We formed a line. Spears out, shields close. They didn't know the meaning of discipline, but they learned it in seconds. When the first attackers reached the barricade, the fire traps ignited. Flames surged upward, screaming through the night. The enemy fell back, but only for a moment. Their leader, tall, masked, carrying a staff tipped with skulls, stepped forward and raised his arms. The others chanted. The air thickened with something primal. Fear. I had seen it before in modern battlefields, in villages too broken to fight. Fear that wasn't just of death, but of meaning. When men start believing their enemy is divine, you lose half the war before the first strike. So I made myself divine. I ran into the fire. The heat bit at my skin, but I kept moving, screaming in a voice that didn't sound human. I picked up one of their fallen spears and drove it through the heart of their front line. The flames turned the world red and gold. The tribe shouted my name, Maka Tehran, again and again, until it became something more than language. The enemy broke. Some fled. Others fell to their knees. When it ended, the valley smelled of blood and smoke. The Tehran cheered, pounding their chests, calling it a victory of gods. But I didn't feel like one. My hands shook, my throat burned from the smoke, and I could still hear the dying whispering prayers to whatever spirits they believed in. At dawn, Sira came to me. She had tended the wounded, washed the dead. Her hands were stained with soot. "You gave them a god," she said quietly. "Now they will expect miracles." "I gave them a chance," I replied. "Miracles," she repeated and turned away. That word haunted me. In the days that followed, Oren ordered the building of new defenses. The Tehran worked under my direction, ditches, watchtowers, signal fires. Caro spent his nights beside me, sketching crude symbols in the dirt to record what we were doing. History, written in mud. But every improvement brought more eyes from the east. Scouts returned with stories of a warlord named Varuk the Man behind the bone masks. His tribe, the Dakar, believed in sacrifice. They took prisoners, not for slaves, but for offerings. Their god, they said, demanded blood to keep the sun alive. And now I had stolen their fire. One evening, as the tribe gathered to eat, a horn sounded from the forest edge. It was low, mournful, endless. Then came the messenger child no older than 10, skin painted white, carrying something wrapped in leaves. He said nothing, only placed it before us and ran back into the trees. When I unwrapped it, my stomach twisted. Inside was a charred skull. "Human," Caro whispered. "A warning." Sira shook her head. "No, a promise." That night, the fires of the Dakar glowed on the horizon, hundreds of them, shimmering like the edge of a storm. I stood on the ridge, wind cold against my face, and realized this wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet, treacherous thought whispered, maybe that's why I was sent here. The attack never came that night, nor the next. The Dakar were patient. They wanted fear to soften us first. Fear is a kind of siege, and it worked. The laughter around the fire dimmed. The children whispered instead of sang. Even Oren's voice carried hesitation. I spent those days reinforcing defenses, mapping the valley, teaching Caro and the others how to read signs' footprints, broken leaves, the curve of smoke in the air. But every task ended the same way, with eyes turning to me for answers I didn't have. I wasn't a god. I was a soldier improvising with sticks and stone. Then she came. It was the third night after the horn. I had gone to the ridge alone, hoping for silence. Instead, I found a figure standing there, back to me, hair long and pale under the starlight. At first, I thought it was Sira, but when she turned, I realized this woman was younger barefoot, her skin marked with spirals of blue pigment, eyes reflecting the moon like liquid silver. She didn't flinch when she saw me. "You are the one who fell," she said, her voice strange like two tones at once. Her tongue was Turan, but it rolled smoother, older. "I am," I answered carefully. "Who are you?" "I am Lyra," she smiled faintly. "I speak for the stars." It sounded like myth, but there was nothing foolish in her eyes. She carried herself with quiet certainty, like someone accustomed to seeing beyond what others could bear. "The D-car burned the sky," she said. "The fire you gave the Tehran burns too bright. It calls to them. So they'll come for it." She nodded. "And for you." Her calm unsettled me more than any threat could. She walked closer, tracing one of the defensive lines I had carved in the dirt. "You draw like the ancients, circles inside circles. But these are not prayers, are they? They're formations," I said. "Ways to keep people alive." Lyra tilted her head. "Alive is not enough. Fire without meaning eats the world." The words sounded like poetry, but something in them struck deep. For the first time since arriving, I felt seen not as a myth, not as a weapon, but as a man trying to make sense of chaos. She visited often after that, sometimes bringing herbs, sometimes silence. The tribe treated her with reverence, stepping aside when she passed. I learned she was not of the Tehran, nor of the Dakar. She belonged to a smaller wandering people keepers of the old stories, half feared, half worshipped. When she spoke, it was as if she remembered the world before it hardened into tribes and gods. "Once all people were one," she told me, "but they broke the sky with their hunger. Now each tribe carries a shard of it. Yours burns brightest." I wanted to tell her the truth, that my tribe hadn't broken the sky yet, but one day would, with machines and bombs and all the brilliance that comes before ruin. But I didn't. How do you tell someone that the world they're building will one day destroy itself? One evening I showed her the stars as I knew them. Orion, Cassiopeia, the old constellations from my time. She listened, fascinated, then shook her head gently. "Those names are forgotten here, but the shapes they remain." She pointed at a cluster near the horizon. "That is the river, where the dead walk home." Her fingers brushed mine, and for a moment the world felt still. No war, no tribes, just two souls staring at a sky older than memory. Caro saw us once, speaking by the fire. Later he asked if she was a spirit. I said no, though I wasn't entirely sure. When Lyra began to dream of the D-car, I started to listen differently. "They are moving," she said one morning, eyes distant. "The wind smells of blood and ash." She was right. 2 days later, scouts returned with news Varek's army had crossed the eastern ridge. Hundreds of warriors. The war had come. But I wasn't the same man who fell here. I had a tribe that trusted me, a boy who'd call me brother, and now a woman who looked at me like I was both curse and salvation. That night, as the first war drums echoed through the trees, Lyra placed her hand on my chest and whispered, "The stars sent you here to choose, to end or to begin." I didn't understand her then, but I would, and the choice would burn more than any fire. War never arrives all at once. It seeps in like smoke under a door until you realize the air itself has changed. The D-car came at dawn. Mist clung to the ground, turning the valley into a gray ocean. The first sign was the silence of birds. The second was the sound hundreds of feet moving in rhythm, a heartbeat made of men. I stood at the ridge beside Caro, watching the line appear through the fog. Warriors painted in black ash, their bodies streaked with red clay, carrying torches that hissed against the damp. At their center marched Varuk the warlord. His armor was bone and hide, his face hidden behind a skull mask. Around his neck hung human teeth like trophies. The Tehran waited behind the barricades, Fear was a living thing among them, breathing in every chest. Orin's voice cracked as he called orders. Sira murmured prayers. Lyra stood apart, eyes fixed on the horizon, whispering words I couldn't hear. When the first horn sounded, I gave the signal. Fire roared to life along the trenches, lines of flame that cut the valley in two. The D-car charged anyway, screaming their god's name. The Tehran broke formation at the sight of them. That's when I ran forward. I don't remember deciding. I just remember movement mud under my boots, the roar in my throat, the flash of flame against the edge of the blade Caro had made for me. Hold the line, I shouted. Not all of them understood the words, but they felt the intent. Caro picked up the cry, turning it into our chant. Maka Tehran! The others joined, voices rising until the chant became a storm. The first wave of D-car hit our barricade and shattered. Spears struck wood and bone. Arrows hissed through the air. Fire spilled over shields. I ducked beneath a swing, drove my blade upward, and felt it bite. The man fell, and I realized he was barely older than Caro. There's a moment in battle when time folds. The body moves faster than thought. The world narrows to breath, blood, and sound. It lived that moment before, but never as something holy. The Tehran fought like people who had finally remembered what they were made of. Every trick I had taught them, flanking, feinting, formation, they used with terrifying precision. For a time it worked. The D-car fell back. Then Varrock raised his staff. He struck the ground once. The chant of his warriors shifted, low, rhythmic, the kind that doesn't just fill your ears, it crawls into your bones. The D-car began throwing clay pots that burst into flame. Oil, crude napalm. The fire leapt across our lines. Men screamed. I saw Caro engulfed in smoke and dove toward him. We rolled through mud, suffocating on heat. My memories twisted. This wasn't a valley anymore. It was Fallujah, it was Kandahar, it was every place I'd ever tried not to remember. When the flames died down, half the Tehran were gone. But the Dakar were bleeding too. Varrock had underestimated us. His forces hesitated, broken by exhaustion and loss. That was when I did the unthinkable. I ordered a counterattack. We hit them as they regrouped, silent and precise. Caro moved like lightning. Orin crushed a skull with his club. I tore the mask from a fallen warrior's face and found not a monster, but a boy. None of them were monsters, just believers. When Varrock finally retreated into the forest, the valley was a graveyard. The Tehran cheered my name again, but this time it sounded wrong, too loud, too sure. Lyra approached me after the battle, her face streaked with ash. You turned men into fire, she said quietly. Do you feel the heat yet? I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night the survivors built a pyre for the dead. The air shimmered with smoke and grief. Sira sang an old song that made the stars seem closer. Caro sat beside me, his arm bandaged, his face glowing with pride. You saved us, he said. I looked at the flames and felt nothing but weight. No, I whispered. I just taught us how to burn slower. Lyra's eyes met mine across the firelight. There was sorrow there, and something else knowing. She turned away and began to walk toward the mountains. Where are you going? I called. To find the dream, she said. The stars told me this is not the last war you will fight. The wind carried her words like smoke through the valley. That night I didn't sleep. I stood beneath the moon, staring at the scars of battle carved into the earth. The future, my world, had followed me here dressed in bones and fire, and I realized something terrible. History doesn't need technology to repeat itself. It just needs people like me. The days after the battle bled together in silence. The valley smelled of smoke and ash, and the river ran dark with soot. We had survived, but survival isn't victory. It's just the permission to feel guilt a little longer. The Tehran buried their dead in circles, each grave marked with a ring of stone. Sira oversaw the rituals, whispering to the spirits as if trying to convince them this wasn't a mistake. Caro limped from camp to camp, smiling for those who needed to see strength. But when the fires went low, I heard him crying softly beside the barricade. Lyra was gone. She had left before dawn 2 days after the battle, vanishing into the mist like she'd never existed. I tried to convince myself that her absence didn't matter, but the truth was simpler and crueler. The valley felt emptier without her, as if the stars themselves had gone silent. Orin wanted to strike first. While Varuk licks his wounds, he said, before he gathers the dead to fight again. His voice carried the urgency of fear disguised as courage. But I had seen what an army fueled by vengeance looked like. I'd commanded them once, in another century. They don't stop at the enemy. They keep burning until there's nothing left. We hold, I told him. We rebuild. We wait. He didn't like it. None of them did. The tribe needed momentum to make sense of grief. They needed movement, not stillness. And stillness is what kills leaders. That night the D-car returned, not an army this time, but a whisper. A single captive stumbled into our camp, clothes torn, skin burned. It was one of our scouts, barely breathing. They took her, he rasped. My chest went cold. Who? The Star Woman. Lyra. He died before finishing the sentence. I left before dawn. I didn't tell Orin, didn't wait for permission. Caro followed anyway. He always did. We moved through the forest in silence, tracking the marks of passage-broken branches, soot-streaked soil, the faint smell of blood in the damp air. The D-car had taken her toward the ruins east of the ridge, a place the Tehran called the Bones of Heaven. Old stone, worn by centuries, rising from the jungle like the ribs of a dead god. Smoke curled from its center. They will offer her, Caro whispered. Offer? He nodded grimly. To their god, to end the fires. I didn't answer. There wasn't time for anger. There was only action. We approached under the cover of rain. The D-car were chanting, hundreds of voices vibrating through the stone. Torches burned in a wide circle around an altar. Lyra knelt at its center, hands bound, eyes open and steady. When she saw me, she didn't look afraid. She looked relieved. You shouldn't have come, she said softly as I reached her. You knew I would. Her smile was small and sad. Then you know what happens next. I cut her bindings. Not if I can help it. The first D-car saw us and shouted. Arrows hissed through the air. Caro threw his spear and took one down. We fought our way toward the outer wall, ducking behind pillars carved with faces that seemed to watch in sorrow. The chant rose higher, angrier. Lyra stumbled but kept moving. They believe my death will end the war, she said, but it will only feed it. A figure stepped into our path, Varuk himself. The skull mask gleamed in the torchlight, the sockets glowing faintly red. You stole the fire, he said, his voice deep and broken, and now the sky demands its price. I raised my blade. Then let it take me. He laughed, a sound like stone breaking. It already has. The fight was brutal and short. He was strong, but rage makes you predictable. When he swung his staff, I caught it, drove my blade into his chest and twisted. His breath left him in a sigh, not a roar. When he fell, the chanting stopped. Hundreds of eyes turned to me. Blood on my hands, fire behind me, and a god's corpse at my feet. Caro lifted his arms, shouting, "The fire god lives." The crowd echoed the cry, wave after wave of devotion crashing into the night. The D-car fell to their knees. And just like that, the war ended, not with surrender, but with worship. Lyra stared at me, her face unreadable. You've replaced one god with another, she said. And you think that's peace? I looked down at Varuk's body. The skull mask still stared up, empty. I didn't want this. She touched my face, her hand trembling. No one ever does. That's how gods are born. When we returned to the valley, the Turayan welcomed us with cheers and tears. Orin bowed. Caro called it destiny, Sira wept in silence, but Lyra didn't join the celebration. That night she went to the river and lit a single candle, letting it drift away. When I found her, she said only one thing. For one tribe to live, one soul must burn. I didn't understand. Not yet. The next morning she was gone again. No footprints. No sign of struggle. Just a single star-shaped charm lying in the dirt where she had stood. I kept it. I still do, because every victory needs a ghost. Weeks passed after Lyra vanished, but her absence was louder than war drums. The D-Car had scattered, half of them swearing allegiance to me, the rest vanishing into the wilderness with eyes full of superstition. The Tarian called it peace. I called it tension, waiting for a spark. They had begun to build monument-style pillars of stone carved with my likeness, spears raised, flames etched around the figure's head. I told them to stop. They called it honor. When I tore one down myself, Orin ordered two more built in its place. The myth had grown beyond me. Even Caro had changed. He carried himself differently now, more confident, less boy, more warrior. He led the young hunters and repeated my words as law. Hold the line. Fire is order. Fear is weakness. He meant well, but hearing my own lessons turned into scripture chilled me. Sira came to me one night while I sat alone by the forge. They believe in you more than themselves, she said. I never asked them to. That's not how belief works, she replied, eyes heavy with fatigue. A spark doesn't ask to be flame. Her words hit harder than she knew. I remembered Lyra's final whisper, own soul must burn. I didn't yet know whose. That night I dreamed of her, not as she was, but surrounded by light stars swirling behind her like a veil. She said nothing, only reached out a hand. When I woke, I knew something was wrong. Caro burst into my tent at dawn. The sky burns. We ran to the ridge. A column of fire rose from the horizon, red as fresh blood. The ground trembled beneath our feet. The Dakar who had fled were returning not as men, but as zealots. At their head marched priests, cloaked in bone, carrying torches that never dimmed. They worship Varrock as a god, Caro said. They say his death lit the sun. The irony made me sick. I gathered the Turan. This is not a war for land, I told them. It's for memory. They want to rewrite it with fire. We can't let them. The battle began at dusk. Both armies faced each other under a sky cracked with thunder. The air stank of oil and fear. Between us stood the ruins, the bones of heaven still scarred from our last fight. They came with drums. We answered with horns. When the first wave hit, the ground shook. Spears clashed, flames hissed, and the air filled with ash, thick enough to taste. I moved through it all like a ghost, calling formations, pulling the wounded back, pushing the line forward. Caro fought beside me, his face streaked with blood and sweat. We can end them, he shouted. I saw his eyes fever bright, full of the same certainty that once lived in mine. Not end, I said. Survive. He didn't hear. None of them did. Then the D-Car priests raised their torches and began to chant. The fire around them grew white-hot, impossible, unnatural. The earth cracked, the ruins glowed. It wasn't magic, it was chemistry. Crude oil, sulfur, saltpeter, someone had taught them what I thought only I knew. My stomach dropped. They had learned from watching me. Flame tore through the valley. The Turan screamed as firewalls erupted between lines. I grabbed a shield, dragged Caro behind cover. We need to break their fuel stores, I shouted. The caves! He nodded, eyes wild, and ran ahead before I could stop him. I followed through smoke and chaos. The caves were half collapsed, glowing like the throat of a volcano. Inside, barrels of tar and clay pots burned. Caro was there, hacking at them with his blade. If it burns, they die. Wait. The explosion swallowed his words. A wave of heat lifted me off the ground. The world became soundless white. When I opened my eyes, the battlefield was gone, just a crater where men and gods had once screamed. I found Caro near the edge, his body broken, barely breathing. He looked at me and smiled through blood. "Fire listens to you," he whispered, and then he was gone. I carried him back through the smoke, the world collapsing into embers around me. The D-car had fled, terrified by their own creation. The Tehran stood silent, watching as I laid their champion on the ground. They began to kneel, one by one, not in grief, but in worship. Cirrus' voice trembled. "The god of fire lives." I wanted to scream. Instead, I looked up at the red sky and said the only truth I could still believe. "No. He dies a little more every time you say his name." But they didn't hear. The chant rose again, louder than thunder. "Maka Tehran, Maka Tehran." And in that moment, I realized Lyra had been right. The battle of gods wasn't between me and Varuk. It was between who I was and what they needed me to be. When dawn broke, it was silent. No drums, no cries, just the hiss of dying fires and the whisper of wind through ash. The valley was gray again, stripped of everything but ghosts. Karos' body lay at the highest ridge. The Tehran buried him with the honors of a king's stone rings, burned offerings, and silence deep enough to echo. I stood apart from them, watching the smoke rise. Each plume looked like a promise I hadn't kept. "Sira came to me when the last embers cooled. He believed you would lead us into the next age," she said. "I led him to his death." Her gaze didn't waver. "That's what kings do." I almost laughed. "I'm no king." But by sunset, it didn't matter what I believed. They gathered in the ruins, every surviving Tehran, and even some D-car who had sworn fealty after the battle. Oren stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in animal hide. When he unwrapped it, I saw what they'd made. A crown, if you could call it that. It was woven from bone and bronze, scorched black, the centerpiece a shard from Varuk's skull mask. Sira spoke, voice trembling but resolute. "The fire has chosen. The god who walked among us must now rule among us." I tried to refuse, but the crowd had already begun to kneel. Hundreds of them, heads bowed, faces streaked with ash. Their voices rose in unison. "Maka Tehran. Maka Tehran." It wasn't a request. It was inevitability. Oren placed the crown on my head. It was heavier than it looked. Cold. Alive almost. The bone pressed against my skin like it remembered every hand it had belonged to. The world tilted. When I spoke, it wasn't my voice that answered. It was something older, something the tribe had already built inside me. "Rise," I said. "The age of fear ends today." Cheers erupted. Drums pounded. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder, carrying a name that no longer belonged to me. For weeks afterward, the Tehran rebuilt faster than I thought possible. They forged weapons from melted remnants of war, shaped stone into fortresses, tamed the rivers with wooden dams. I watched them transform under my orders, efficient, disciplined, powerful. Civilization was being born, and it wore my shadow. Lyra's charm hung from my neck, the only piece of softness left. At night, Eid hold it and whisper to the stars, asking where she'd gone. No answer ever came. Oren governed the people in my name. Sira became the keeper of laws. I taught them how to record grain, track seasons, forge stronger metal, and with every lesson, I felt history bend. The age of myth was giving way to something sharper, something closer to the world it left behind. But progress always has a cost. One evening, a group of elders came to me, dragging a Prisionera boy accused of stealing food. They asked what should be done. "Feed him," I said. Oren shook his head. "The people demand order." "As a child." "Then teach him consequence," Sira murmured. I looked around and saw it the expectation, the hunger for authority. They didn't want mercy. They wanted justice made visible, so I gave it to them. The boy was exiled beyond the ridge, into the forest. His mother screamed until her voice broke. The tribe watched, silent, satisfied. I could feel something closing inside me. That night I sat alone in the ruins, the same place I had killed Varukin, pressed my hands against the cold stone. "This isn't what I meant," I whispered. The wind answered with a sound like distant weeping. Then faintly I heard her voice, Lyris carried on the air. "You cannot build peace with fire. It only learns to spread." I looked up. The stars had shifted again. The river, the constellation she loved, was fading from the sky. Sira found me at dawn. "The people are preparing for coronation rites," she said. "It's done," I replied. "The crown is already mine." She shook her head. "Not the crown of bone, the crown of belief. You must stand before them at the fire mountain. Only then will the gods accept you fully." I understood the ritual's meaning instantly. A symbolic death, a king reborn in flame. But in their eyes, the symbol had already become literal. The fire mountain wasn't a place. It was a volcano, active, waiting. I stared toward it, its smoke curling like a warning into the sky. Maybe this was always where the path led. A soldier turned king, a man mistaken for God, walking into the fire he started. That night, I made my decision. If the age of fire was to begin, it would start with me walking into its heart, not as a god, but as proof that even gods can burn. The fire mountain rose like a wound against the horizon. Smoke bled from its summit day and night, drifting over the valley like the memory of every battle it fought. The Turan called it the breath of the sky, believing the gods slept beneath it. I knew better. It was a volcano, alive, restless, waiting. They prepared for the coronation for 7 days. On the 8th, I walked barefoot through the valley as they lined the path with torches. Children threw ash petals, warriors beat their shields in rhythm, and Sira led the chant. It wasn't celebration, it was worship disguised as duty. Every sound pressed against my skull until the noise became unbearable. I wanted to tell them to stop, that no man should be praised like this, but I saw their eyes. They needed this story, the one where a god rose from fire and taught them how to shape the world. If I denied it, the world they built would collapse with me. When we reached the volcano's base, the heat hit like a wall. Lava veins glowed through cracks in the rock, pulsing like a heartbeat. The air shimmered with the scent of sulfur and rain. Orin approached, carrying a long blade, the same one had once used in battle, reforged and gleaming. He knelt and offered it to me. "The people await your word, my king." I took it, feeling the weight of metal shaped by my own lessons. Iron, their first creation born of human will instead of chance. This was the beginning of the age they would remember as progress, and the beginning of my erasure as a man. I climbed alone toward the crater. The sound grew deeper with every step, the mountain breathing. At the top, the world opened into a sea of light and smoke. I could feel its pull, its gravity. It reminded me of the experiment, the hum, the flash, the moment everything ended. Maybe time was a line after all. Maybe it was a circle. Below, the Turan watched. Their chants rose in waves. The fire painted their faces gold and red. I lifted the blade, not as a weapon, but as confession. "I gave you the fire," I said, my voice carrying over the roar. "But fire alone will not save you. It will ask for everything you love, and still it will hunger." They didn't understand. They weren't meant to. I drove the blade into the ground. Sparks leapt upward, scattering into the wind like stars escaping the earth. The mountain rumbled in answer. Sira stepped forward, her voice shaking. "The gods accept the offering, but I hadn't offered them anything yet. Not really." The ground trembled harder. Cracks tore through the slope. I turned back to the people and shouted, "Run!" They did move at first, Worship is stronger than fear. It took the first burst of molten rock to break their trance. Then panic spread like wildfire. I ran down the slope, grabbing whoever I could, pushing them toward the valley. Oren tried to pull me along, but I shoved him away. Get them to the river. He hesitated, eyes wide. What about you? I started this. He didn't argue. He ran. The sky darkened. Ash fell like black snow. I could barely breathe through the smoke. The mountain roared again, a sound older than language. Through the chaos, I saw her. Lyra. She stood at the ridge, calm amidst destruction, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Whether she was real or memory didn't matter. I stumbled toward her, every step heavier than the last. You kept your promise, she said softly. One soul must burn. I didn't understand, I gasped. You do now? She reached out a hand. I felt the heat around me surge, the air twisting, the same hum that had once thrown me through time. I took her hand. For a moment, everything was light. Then silence. When the smoke cleared, the mountain was quiet. The Tehran watched from afar as the fire died. They said the god had entered the earth to sleep again, leaving them his gift iron. In the years that followed, they would forge blades, tools, and chains. They would build kingdoms and myths. And in every story, they would speak of the man who came from the sky and gave them the age of fire. But they would never say his name, because gods don't have names. They have echoes, and mine would ring through time long after my body was ash. The first sound I heard was rain, not the hiss of ash or the crackle of fire, just rain. Gentle, relentless. It took me a long time to realize I was still alive. When I opened my eyes, the world was dim and gray. The mountain was silent behind me, its fury spent. The valley below had changed. Drivers carved new paths through blackened soil. Forests burned to white skeletons. The air smelled of iron and wet stone. I tried to move. My legs obeyed, barely. My hands were burned. My skin streaked with soot. The crown was gone. The blade was gone. The fire had taken everything but the memory of what it done. I wandered for days, following the river that had once been the heart of the Tehran lands. There were no voices, no drums, no laughter, only silence and the weight of what I had created. On the fourth day, I found them, a small group survivors, Sierra among them, older now, though it couldn't have been more than a few months. Time felt wrong here, folded, blurred. They bowed when they saw me. I told them not to. You're still alive, she said softly. Unfortunately, I replied. She smiled sadly. The mountains spared you. The gods have their reasons. The gods are gone, I said. All that's left are stories. And stories are enough, she whispered. They led me to what remained of the settlement. The valley was reborn in strange ways fields growing from black earth, richer than before. Rivers gleaming with metallic dust. Children ran among the ruins, their laughter thin but real. Oren had died leading people to safety. Karos' name became a prayer for courage. Lyra, no one remembered her. That hurt most of all. The Tehran built again, stronger, more organized. They forged tools from ore drawn out of the mountainside iron, pure and sharp. Their fires burned hotter. Their eyes held the light of knowledge they didn't fully understand. They called it the Age of Iron. I watched from a distance, a ghost haunting his own creation. They didn't recognize me anymore. Some said the god of fire had ascended to the stars. Others said he walked among them in disguise. Either way, I let them believe what they needed to. At night, I carved my story into the stone near the riverbank. Not for them. For whoever might find it when time had looped back on itself. For the world had come from where the one that would come after. I was a soldier, I wrote, a man of the 20th century. I came here by accident. I tried to survive. I taught them what I knew. I thought knowledge would save them. I was wrong. I paused, then scratched one last line beneath it. The future doesn't start with fire, it ends with it. When the carvings were done, I sat beneath the stars. The sky had changed again. The constellations were drifting new shapes, forming where the old ones faded. I thought of Lyra, of her calm voice, her eyes full of galaxies. I wondered if she'd ever been real, or if the mountain had shaped her out of the light it carried here from another world. Was this what you meant? I whispered into the dark. Is this what it means to choose? The wind answered with silence. I took the charm she had left me, the star-shaped pendant, and hung it on a branch overlooking the water. It swayed in the breeze, catching the faintest glimmer of dawn. That was when I made the recording. The last one. My voice cracked, but it didn't matter. If anyone finds this, I wasn't a god. I wasn't a king. I was a man who fell too far and mistook survival for destiny. The people here will build their empires on what I gave them. They'll call it progress. Maybe they'll even reach the stars, and maybe they'll make the same mistakes we did. But if you're listening, if time has circles and not line, remember this. Fire isn't evil. It's just hungry. What matters is what you feed it. I stopped the recorder and let it fall into the river. The current took it, carrying my words toward a horizon that might never exist. Then I turned back toward the mountains, walking until the valley disappeared behind me. They say history forgets the man and remembers the myth. Maybe that's mercy. Maybe it's punishment. All I know is that somewhere, far in the future, or far in the past, a soldier will read my words and understand. Hell know that the first god of fire was just a man who couldn't find his way home. And hell know that the story never really ends.